There are rivalries that define certain eras in professional wrestling. While many of these rivalries tend to be the pinnacle of the industry for their time, there are some that happen on a much smaller scale without compromising quality. Growing up, I'm thankful that I was encouraged to watch non-WWE wrestling by my dad. It opened a whole new world to a young Tranquilo, and I discovered many wrestlers who kids at school had no idea of. At some point during my childhood fandom of wrestling, I came across a series of matches that completely blew my mind. Those matches were none other than the trilogy between Samoa Joe and CM Punk. By the time I saw these matches for the first time, Punk had already gone to WWE and Joe had already joined TNA. Young me felt like an ultra wrestling nerd watching these guys wrestle each other during their formative years as performers. I remember loving these matches back then because they felt intimate due to the smaller, more contained atmosphere of Ring of Honor. I'm a little ashamed to admit it, but I didn't rewatch these matches until just a couple of years ago for the first time. But I'm glad that I did because it instantly took me back to the day I watched them for the first time. The rivalry between Punk and Joe not only defined a company, it defined the careers of two wrestlers who would go on to become legends of the industry, and in my opinion, it defined what many people now consider to be the golden age of independent wrestling. The first of the highly acclaimed trilogy matches took place on June 12, 2004. Contrary to popular belief, Joe and Punk had wrestled each other in Ring of Honor almost an entire year earlier, but that match isn't part of the story. The story starts here in 2004. Samoa Joe came into this match having been ROH World Champion for 448 days. To say he was dominant would be an understatement, considering he had run through practically the entire roster at this point. But it was one half of Ring of Honor Tag Team Champion CM Punk who was now stepping up. Having watched many try to step up only to fail, one assumed that Punk came into this with a strategy. Keep in mind, while these guys were popular in ROH, they were hardly the superstars they are now. This was merely the beginning of their rise to superstardom. CM Punk had one plan going into this first match: use the headlock. Punk's plan was to tire out the dominant world champion by locking in the headlock whenever he could in order to neutralize and limit him. Joe being the hard-hitting final boss that he was, it made sense for Punk to use this strategy. Make no mistake about it though, Punk's plan in this match wasn't perfect. When Joe saw an opening to strike, he did, and he did it hard. Commentary plays its role perfectly by pointing out that Joe is tired around the point he usually wins matches in. While Punk is indeed able to wear Joe out a bit as the match goes on, he still takes brutal offense from Joe every now and then. At this point, it becomes crystal clear. Both men are fighting with their mind in an attempt to outsmart the other. It's essentially a boxing match, but better of course, because it's pro wrestling at its best. Very late into the match, as both men fight to stay alive, we see Joe struggling to put Punk away due to the constant headlocks he suffered, but we also see Punk struggling to keep the headlock going as he himself has worn himself out and taken a beating from Joe. After 50 long minutes of war, we enter the final act. Punk is finally able to hit the Pepsi plunge, but he can't make the cover due to the damage his legs have taken from Samoa Joe. In a last-ditch effort, Punk hits a DDT on Joe, but Joe kicks out and we hit the time limit of 60 minutes. The match ends in a draw. Neither man could put the other away. Neither man could outsmart the other. In the end, they stood on equal ground. And despite the crowd chanting for 5 more minutes, this would have to be decided at a later date. CM Punk and Samoa Joe shook hands in an iconic image that would only grow in legend over the years. Punk had every reason to believe he could beat Joe after their first match, and the same goes for Samoa Joe. If anything, this was a case of both sides underestimating the other. Now that they had gone the distance once, surely they both know what to do the next time. That next time would come 4 months later, on October 16th, 2004. This time, ROH was in Punk territory. Despite this show emanating from Chicago, Punk vs. Joe 2 wasn't the original plan. Punk was a stand-in for Steve Corino, who had been pulled from this show by Japanese promotion 01. The stage was perfectly set for a last-minute rematch between Punk and Joe. The crowd is firmly behind the hometown hero and they believe this is his moment, and yet Joe is hardly fazed. I should also point out that Punk is no longer a tag team champion, which just added to the belief that this was his time. The start of this match implies that both men won't stray away from what worked in their first bout. Punk with the headlock and Joe with the power advantage. Punk is avoiding Joe's attempts to bait him into a strike fight, but eventually Joe gets the better of him. Punk is chain wrestling, working Joe's arm with some surprise pins here and there, while Joe is using his size to his advantage. After the 30-minute mark, Joe takes control as he starts to dominate with a wider arsenal than the first time around. At this point, Punk is fighting to stay alive. Desperation sets in during the final stages of the match when Punk sees an opening. He throws the kitchen sink at Joe by locking in an Anaconda Vice, hitting a Shining Wizard, a Pepsi Twist, and a Moonsault, but it's not enough. Punk fails to hit Joe with a Pepsi Plunge, but it's Joe who then hits Punk with a Muscle Buster as the time runs out. Yet another 60-minute time limit draw between these two competitors. While it felt like Punk's moment early in the match, it was a fight to stay alive until the end. But he did it. Samoa Joe had Punk beat, but he was simply too late. Despite coming much closer to losing this time around, CM Punk still felt like a star. And Joe? Well, he remained the Monster World Champion for a reason. Punk requested that the next match have no time limit, ensuring the crowd that there would be a next time, as both men shook hands once more. At this point, both men are the talk of Ring of Honor, and yet we haven't found out who the better man is. Fans wouldn't have to wait much longer, as Punk vs. Joe 3 would take place only 2 months later on December 4th, 2004. Samoa Joe's reign as ROH World Champion is now sitting at a staggering 623 days. This time around, there would be no time limit. We were guaranteed a winner. Joe had his own request, however, as it was announced that if Joe beat Punk this time around, Punk would not be able to challenge for the ROH World title so long as Joe remained champion. Since there's no time limit for this match, Punk is more than okay with going back to his trusted headlock wear him out strategy that got him here. Joe on the other hand is going ballistic, pulling out all the hard hitting offense to the point where Punk is busted open. Punk is now working Joe's neck in hopes that this alongside the headlock will help him gain control of his opponent. This match is far harder hitting and moving at a much more blistering pace compared to the previous 2 bouts. While the previous 2 matches were chess matches, this was a straight up fight after the opening minutes. And then, deep into this match, when Joe has Punk in a sleeper, and just when the ref calls for the bell, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, who was sitting at ringside to watch the match, stops the timekeeper and forces the match to keep going due to noticing Punk still having fight left in him. This gives Punk an opening who rolls himself back for a near count. As we enter the final stretch, we see both men desperately trying to get the win. Joe tries to pin Punk by cheating with his feet on the rope, which gets him massive heat from a crowd that respects him. Meanwhile, Punk gets near fall after near fall to no avail. Joe finally finds his opening by countering a roll-up by Punk, hitting him with a combination of a coquina clutch, a German suplex, a dragon suplex, back into the clutch. Punk has given it everything he's got. He's made it this far, but this was the end of the road for him, as the referee calls for the bell and Samoa Joe gets the win. On his 3rd try, Samoa Joe defeats CM Punk to retain the ROH World title in a match that went just over 31 minutes. There was no more doubt, Joe was the better man, and Punk would no longer be able to challenge for the ROH World title for the duration of Joe's reign. Despite Punk being unable to defeat Joe, he would eventually beat the guy who beat Joe for the belt, Austin Aries. That reign would lead to the first ever Summer of Punk, which saw Punk become public enemy number 1 to the Ring of Honor audience after it was announced he was leaving for WWE. Meanwhile, Joe left for TNA shortly after dropping the ROH World title, meaning he and Punk went their own separate ways for over a decade. Punk exploded in popularity in WWE while Joe became a mainstay in TNA. By the time Joe's time with TNA came to an end and he joined WWE, Punk had already been gone for a year and left wrestling altogether. It seemed as if these two would never share a ring together again. That is, until AEW came to be, and for the first time in 18 years, CM Punk and Samoa Joe stood face to face once more on the premiere episode of Collision. A legendary rivalry that set both men on their paths to become legends of the game has now been reignited. And now they will finally go 1v1 in the Owen Hart Foundation tournament. This rivalry wasn't about the glamour and glitz of pro wrestling. It was about who was the better man. And for now, for the past 18 years, CM Punk has had to live with the fact that Joe is the better man. This is a rivalry that wasn't meant to be reignited, but AEW has made the impossible possible. This is professional wrestling at its very best, the stuff of legend. a feud that paved the way for independent wrestling and made an AEW possible. So when Punk locks in that headlock on Joe, just remember that there's a reason why. When Joe locks in the coquina clutch on Punk, remember that there's a reason why. Because there's a reason for everything in this feud, but it's no longer about honor. It's about who truly is elite.